Hi, I'm Kurt Barber. Welcome to Spot the Lies series. This is episode 9. Today, I'll be interviewing Dr. Erica Rosenberg. She is an expert in microfacial expressions, also the facial action coding system, which was developed in part by Dr. Paul Eckman. It was popularized by the television series Lie to Me. As I mentioned, she is a world-renowned expert in this subject matter. She did receive her PhD in health psychology from University of California, San Francisco. She's also authored several books, including textbooks and What the Face Reveals, in conjunction with Dr. Paul Eckman. So sit back, relax. Hey, I'm Kurt Barber, and I'm here on Spot the Lies episode series, and I am with Dr. Erica Rosenberg. How are you doing? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm doing fine today.
Excellent. We'll get right into the questions here. I have spoken previously about Dr. Paul Eckman on some of my series here. How did you get to meet Dr. Paul Eckman?
I met Paul Eckman in graduate school. I went to UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, to work on my PhD in health psychology. And I entered the program in 1987. And at the time, I was interested in stress and health. That's why I started this program. I had no idea that Paul Eckman was at this university, and I didn't really know who he was at the time because I was very into like neuroscience and physiological psychology at the time, and I didn't, it really wasn't on my radar. So I spent my first year of graduate school trying to learn as much as I could about stress and how to measure it. And that journey led me to start questioning whether stress was the best thing to look at when you're talking about, how our psychological lives or our response to events affects our physiology. It seemed to me that any given event, which is how stress was often defined in the literature at that time, like whether some significant thing happened, like, you have medical board exams, or there's been a divorce, or, you're bereaved, all these significant life events were sort of how the field was defining stress in terms of research. And it seemed to me it was more important to look at how people responded emotionally to different situations. So I started getting interested in mood and emotion when, I remember this was like the spring of '88. We had a pro seminar for the graduate students where different faculty would come in each week. This was a Friday afternoon seminar and talk about their work because people were trying to kind of link up with advisors, for their work. And just about the time, it was one of these interesting timing things, just about the time I was getting frustrated with stress and realizing I need to look at mood or emotion, Paul Eckman shows up at the pro seminar, and he starts talking about his work. And it was one of these mind-blowing things to me, because what he was making clear is that he had come up with a way to make something so inherently subjective as emotion observable and amenable to scientific study, which was exactly what I was looking for, right? And I mentioned that I had sort of a neuroscience physiological orientation, so I was a little frustrated with a lot of the measurement in psychology. And here was this like quantifying muscular action, what? So I was just really excited. I met him in the spring of 1988 in graduate school, and I contacted him right afterwards and said, "This is really great. I'd like to talk more." And he invited me to a meeting at his lab, and we had a discussion. And then the next thing he did was hand me a copy of Darwin's 1872 book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And he said, "Read this, and then we'll talk again." So that was the beginning. And I look at that as the entree into this whole world that I never really planned on getting into. I got into that whole field because I wanted to study how, stress and or emotion affected health. And it led to this whole journey into emotion, facial expression, facts. It was quite an explosive moment, if you will, that happening at that time. So that's how I met Paul.
Well, you mentioned FACS, facial action coding system, one of his notable contributions here. Did you work with him on some of the research that he was doing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I was so I my first year working, in his laboratory, I learned facts. That was one of the first things I did. And facts, the facial action coding system, was and still is designed to be self-instructional. So at the time, I had the previous edition of the manual. The This was 88, so the manual first came out in 78, and it wasn't redone until 2002. So I learned with the 78 manual, and I had, and again, he handed me a binder and a VHS cassette and said, "Go learn this." And I went off and learned it. It was difficult to fit it all in because I was also early in graduate school taking a lot of classes. But it's after a few months, I had learned it and took the final test and passed. And then like no, I was the only graduate student in his lab at the time. He had a lot of postdoctoral fellows, and did a lot of work collaboratively with Bob Levinson at UC Berkeley. And they had there were several projects. People who were in his lab often worked on coding some of his projects. Some of the work that they did on facial expression and psychophysiology with with Bob Levinson. So I worked on that, and then my dissertation, I was able to bring facts back to health, physical health, and I looked at anger and heart disease. And this was a major, my dissertation piece was part of a major collaborative project that he was working on with folks at Duke Medical Center in North Carolina. So I did work with him on a lot of research, mainly through facts coding and then my own studies. And we did about 3 or 4 different studies together in addition to my dissertation.
Excellent. So can you tell me a little bit more about facts?
Facts, yes, I can talk about facts till the cows come home, as they say. Facts is the facial action coding system. It is a system designed to comprehensively describe all observable facial behavior. What's important to know about facts is that facts codes facial action based on how the muscles contract. It is not a tool for measuring emotion. It is a tool for measuring observable facial action, and that is what made it so powerful. Hold on, I need to mute my phone. I muted my computer, but I didn't mute my phone. So let me mute my phone so we don't get beeped. There we go. Do not disturb. So, facts measures all observable facial behavior in terms of anatomically based elements. And those anatomically based elements are called action units. Action units are the observed effect of a certain facial muscle contracting. So it's not the muscle itself. It's as a muscle contracts, what does it do to the face on the outside? So there's muscle, there's connective tissue and fat and skin, and the AU is looking at it from the outside. So when I contract zygomaticus major, which is this large set of fibers that originates up here on the cheekbone and the zygomatic arch and attaches near the lip corner, when I contract that muscle, that's action unit 12. If I lift the middle portion of the frontalis muscle, which is a big muscle in the middle of the forehead, that's action unit 1. There are 44, 45, depending on how you divide it up, different action units that correspond on close to a 1-to-1 basis with underlying facial musculature. So the power of this tool is it allows for objective description of facial movement. And any inferences about emotion are made after the face is coded. Facts coding refers to describing any facial expression in terms of the AUs that comprise it. So, anything like if I do here and make what we often recognize as the facial expression of surprise, I'm lifting my brow and I'm mentioning numbers for the action unit. Each action unit is labeled with an arbitrary numeric code. I mean, it's not arbitrary once you learn it, but that when they were chosen, they were arbitrary, right? So when I lift the brow, that's action units 1 and 2. My upper eyelid is 5. I open my jaw, my lips, drop my jaw, that's 25 and 26. So this is a 1, 2, 5, 25, and 26. Any facial expression you make, it could be, something that's, not necessarily about an emotion, right? It doesn't have to be emotional. Any configuration of facial actions can be described in facts. And once you get these combinations, like I said, 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 25 plus 26, we know from research that that's what people tend to do when they're surprised. But there are a lot of different variations on that. Sometimes people just use the upper face, or sometimes just the jaw drop. So facts is about the observed effects of facial muscles contracting.
With
Period.
facts, it doesn't matter which hemisphere of your brain is dominant.
Um, it shouldn't.
Okay.
What that might affect is symmetry of pose behavior. Like the stuff that's been done on hemispheric dominance and symmetry seems to be, when I say symmetry, I mean symmetry of facial actions, like whether it's stronger on one side or the other. There were studies done years ago. Joan Barad, I think this is way back in the 20th century, about facial asymmetries in expressions and then making inferences about hemispheric dominance. That only makes sense for deliberate facial expressions, and especially there's this issue of which region of the face, because it's not always, some areas are contralateral and some areas are ipsilateral control. So spontaneous behavior that is like that involuntarily comes forth, as far as I know, is less reflective of hemispheric bias, laterality, shall we say. But it's hard to test it. The research that's been done mostly been done on pose behavior, not spontaneous behavior.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with facts, does it matter culturally? Will we, I guess, have the same expressions regardless of culture?
You just asked two questions. You said, does facts differ or matter culturally? And then you said, well, we have the same expressions. Facts is about the observed effects of contracting the muscle. That actually doesn't matter where you live. When people ask me that, I say, well, if you're a heart surgeon, does that mean you can do heart surgery in Kenya? Sure you can. The heart's the heart. The facial muscles are the facial muscles. So all that facts does is describe the movement of the facial muscles. It doesn't tell you what they mean. When you get to whether people show certain expressions in certain situations, that can vary culturally quite a bit, but that's not facts. Do you see the difference? And
Yes.
that's what you asked. I'm really glad you asked it, because it's a very common question, because people know about culture variation in emotion displays. There's a small set of consistent facial displays of emotion that seem to hold up around the globe for like anger, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust. That's about it. Everything else around that can have quite a bit of cultural variability. And even within each of those emotions, there can be, within and across cultures, some slight variations. But beyond that, there is a huge amount of variability. That's not facts, though. That's the combination, that's what this configuration, which is comprised of many different action units, is how people interpret it or what situations they occur in. It's not the same as facts. So facts does hold up cross-culturally, yes. Doesn't, as long as you have a working face, every once in a while there's a birth defect and people aren't born with certain muscles, but that's not culturally bound.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for describing the differences there.
Yeah, it's important.
So, now I mentioned that I'm interested in deception, and in your YouTube channel, you've actually talked about a number of police agencies contacting you about microfacial expressions and their meaning in deception. Have you gotten a lot of interest within the law enforcement community for this?
Yes, and it's not as much recently. It's more, 10 years ago or so. It's early 20th, 21st century. There was a period of time where I would find, well, first of all, occasionally I'm asked by somebody on some case to make some comments on something. And I've also been involved in helping train people who do interrogations, like you. And I've had there was a period of time, this is about a decade ago, where a local police department was regularly sending some of their detectives to my fax workshop. to learn facts, not to learn about micro expressions, whatever, but just to learn facts. And I would make sure, whenever anybody embarks on taking a facts class from me, I want to make sure they know what they're learning. You're not learning micro expressions, you're not learning emotion expressions. I'm not teaching you about deception. I am teaching you how this comprehensive, incredibly rich tool for recognizing, and identifying all observable facial movement. And so they were all clear on that, and they wanted to do it anyway. And the reason was that it helps learning facts can train in a really fine sensitivity to subtle changes in facial behavior, because you have to learn all folds. When we're learning the action units, we don't just learn what muscle tends to move, we know what they look like. We learn what they look like. So when action unit 9, which wrinkles the nose, what does it look like? It pulls up the nose, it lifts the upper lip, it creates wrinkles here, it pulls down on the center of the brow, it creates a fullness here in this upper inner corner of the infraorbital triangle. It may separate the lips. These are all appearance changes for AU9. And so learning that for, dozens of action units is detailed work, but it changes the way you look at faces. You can't see faces the same ever again. So I think this is a bit of an aside, but it was just like, I think that chief was sending his detectives to me because it was making them more in tune to facial behavior. And in terms of deception, I mean, a lot of it's stuff that you probably already know. I mean, it's just the importance of not relying on one piece of information. The face is not an endpoint. The face is a guide, and to look at things like the relationship, the coherence between what you're getting from the face and what you're getting from the words and what you're getting from the voice and maybe some other nonverbal channels. So if someone says, how are you feeling? And they say, I'm feeling fine, but they're showing signs of anxiety or fear in their brow, maybe that's a red flag, right? That says they say they're feeling fine, but their face doesn't say they're feeling fine. And then that's not an endpoint. That's a place where you might want to go back and probe later. You don't skip a beat when it shows up, as you just take note that showed up. And that's not the most important thing. The thing that I get concerned with, and if you are writing a book, that you should be concerned with, that people like to take these easy things and take them as an answer. With deception, you have to paste together a picture, and that doesn't fit. Okay, I need more information about that. Who knows why the brow is fearful? Maybe it's because that makes them really nervous at that moment. Maybe it's not that they're hiding something, or maybe they are hiding something, but it's something about a thought that has nothing to do with what they're being accused of or what they're being interrogated about. So I always feel that with the detection of deception, it's a very tender, precious ethical space, and that we have people's lives in our hand, and that you have to be really careful what you do with the information.
Well, I'm glad you brought all that up, because I do speak on this channel as well as in the book that I'm writing about clustering of behaviors, not just within the face, but, nonverbal and verbal behaviors, and in context to what you're seeing.
Right.
So putting it all together, such as you elaborated, is very important. It's essential, really, in terms of trying to figure out why you're seeing these behaviors. So you answered actually quite a few questions there. So I really appreciate your in-depth dive into that. And you also mentioned the fact that you combine what you might see with the microfacial expressions with body language, or what they're saying and their tone, their cadence, and all that. So
the voice is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
The voice, I don't mean the words. I mean what the vocal cords are doing, because that's actually a channel that's the most difficult to control. The face is harder than words, and the voice is harder than the face. And I know in a lot of deception research, at least some of the most impressive stuff that like Eckman and Friesen and Mark Frank did, all of them did together, was really the best job at distinguishing when people were deceptive or not, was a combination of face and voice as clues.
Yeah. So here's another question. And I know throughout time, a lot of natural behaviors will be displayed, whether that be microfacial expressions, body language, whatever the case may be. Is it possible for someone to completely control microfacial expressions?
Um, People can learn to control their face, but let's talk about what microexpressions really are. You probably know, but I feel like the term has been over applied, and lie to me had a lot to do with that. Did you? Which I was always trying to educate the writers not to overuse that word.
Yeah.
I was a consultant on that show. Technically speaking, an expression is called a microexpression based on timing. Micro means timing; it doesn't mean the magnitude. So a microexpression is a display, usually a full configuration of emotion, according to Eckman and Friesen's definition. That occurs. It takes like, what is it? Anywhere from a 25th to a half of a second. So it's super fast. Usually, invisible to the naked eye unless you're fax trained, and then you can't help but notice these things because you notice that level of detail. Because they're so quick, they are often occurring outside conscious control, and it's very difficult to manipulate them because you probably don't know that you're doing them. The only way to manipulate them is maybe to change your state, so if you get yourself into feeling different, they might be less likely to show up. I should also say there's not nearly as much research on micro expressions as there is on macro expressions. And macro expressions are expressions that are longer than that. And a lot of the things that come out when people are in any kind of situation and being recorded, whether it's an emotional situation, whether it's deceptive or not, um, uh, many of those things aren't micro expressions. Some of them last more than a half a second. So I just need to say that, and sometimes they're subtle expressions where an action is just really like I'm talking to you and I suddenly start tensing my lips just a little bit. That's a more subtle. It's not a full-fledged display. The subtle expressions and the micro ones, I think people are less likely to know that they are showing them. If you learn that you do these things and train yourself on your own behavior, you can probably learn to control them a little bit. Or if these are directly reflecting a felt state, if you can learn to control the feeling, then that would be something that would have an impact on what comes out. But I think macro expressions are easier to control than micro expressions simply because they're so often, the latter, micro expressions, are usually outside of awareness. People don't know they're doing it. So then it's harder to control it. It's very difficult to perform them. So when you say about control, there's a couple different ways we can talk about control. There's control as in eliminate or hide, and then there's control as in manipulate and perform, right? And if you're trying to perform them, it's almost impossible because they're so fast. You can't deliberately pose something that quickly. That's not how the facial anatomy works. If I'm going to like say, okay, I'll do a real quick fear face. That was longer right there than a micro expression. And again, going back to lie to me, when they wanted to do this, I said, if you're going to want people to deliberately perform these, you're going to have to remove frames later. So instead, what we decided to do is reverse engineer the faces to the story, meaning let's see what the actors do, then we'll write them into the story.
Mm-hmm.
That was more what we were trying to do by season 2. But at any rate, so that's a complicated answer to your question. Can you control them? Yes, and it's very difficult, and it's probably not going to be a micro expression unless you change actually your feeling toward the situation that's calling forth the expression.
Well, thank you. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
What do you think is the most important takeaway from our discussion today about facts and microfacial expressions?
It's all a lot more complicated than you think. It's not, people want easy recipes. They want to say, if you look for this, then you'll know this. It makes a great popular post or magazine article or something. But to detect deception is complex and dangerous. And I think people, it's very appealing to people to want to be able to do that. On the other hand, they have to know that it's It's not something that has simple answers. The face is one tool among many. The best picture that you're going to get about how anybody's feeling about anything, not just deception, but even for measuring emotion. It's sort of, you know, considered part of, the it's one of the 10 commandments, if you will, of emotion research, that you have to get multiple measures. You can't just rely on what people say they feel. You can't just rely on what their faces are doing. You can't just rely on their physiology. The more measures, the better, because really when you talk about something like an emotion, you can't directly observe an emotion. One of the terms that I like to use, borrowing from statistics, is that it's like a latent variable. It's not directly measurable. So we approximate it from all these different angles, face, feelings, what the people say they feel, what their physiology is doing, what situation they're in. And you mentioned this earlier, the situation is incredibly important. And the layers of situations, the proximal situation, the cultural context, all these things. So there's a lot of rich information in the face. It gives us things that we can't get from people's words, because it often shares, we talked about micro expressions and the people are often not aware of it. It often shares things that people aren't even aware that they're sharing. And that's all the more reason why we have to treat them with great respect and confidentiality. Because people, whether you're using it for research or using it interpersonally, like in relationships, people learn these things, and then you're having a conversation with your partner or something, and they suddenly, show like a quick fear micro expression. You don't want to nail them and say, "Why did you show that fear?" That's it. Like with the interrogator, you note that, and try to find out more about it later. So we have a lot of responsibility when we have the skills to measure these things. And I feel like any field where there's a rich knowledge, the more you know you don't know. And when you know a little, it's dangerous.
Well, thank you very much for your explanation. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's been fun talking to you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Dr. Rosenberg today. Remember, you can like and subscribe on YouTube at Kurt Barber. We will see you next time for our next episode in Spot the Lie.